All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and I want to welcome you to the second in our public events that are associated with the Policy Matters class. How many of you are students in the class? Okay. How many of you are here just public attendees? All right, great. And welcome to both. The Policy Matters class, for those of you who are from the public, is a class that the Department of History, Sociology, Political Science, and Public Policy Center all do collaboratively. And our goal is to really expose primarily freshmen and sophomores, but all undergraduate students, to both topics that they might not get exposed to otherwise, but also people. And then with these public components, not just the students, but also share the wisdom, if you will, and in this case, it will be a lot of wisdom here around issues of poverty. And there are a lot of very challenging public policy issues relating to poverty. Obviously, poverty can be defined in many, many different ways, and we'll be hearing about a variety of those, from food to housing and other things that are here. And these are all people that are on the ground and really involved in those in a very tangible way. So when we talk about the academic and policy, academic side of it, let's just say, we do have some of the more theoretical and how do you want to do these things big picture, but then there's also what's really happening, and we really want to expose everybody to both sides of that, and it's really important. I want to again thank Professors Colin Gordon and Sarah Brooke for their leadership on this class. It's really been important in the transition from a regular class into one of the big ideas classes, and using the tile classrooms and the interactive nature of it, which I think is really a real important change that we're making with a lot of these classes that, again, try to make it a little bit more applied or a little more of interest, if you will. I'm going to take this opportunity, since we're talking about food some, to let you know about a fundraiser that the Public Policy Center is going to be involved in for the food bank on December 20th down at the Mill. For anybody who is interested, from 5 to 8, there'll be information that we'll be getting out. Our band will be playing as a part of that fundraiser, so come down, support the food bank, and have some fun.
Our band, meaning you're singing?
Yes, that I am singing and playing harmonica as a part of this band.
Worth coming to?
Yes, or not, because of that, depending on how you want to view it. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Brooke.
Okay, so I'll make this brief because we want to get to the show here. But as we did with the labor market policy panel, we have asked everybody here to come because they play a different role in the policy making process. So whether they're on the ground in different ways, at different levels of government, whether it's nonprofit, whether they get some sort of funding from government, we've asked them here because they have different perspectives and different positions within the policy making process. So today's panel is really poverty, policy, and practice. So you all have read a lot of things, especially if you're in the class, obviously, about how we do this, levels of government, what we do, what we don't do, what are our approaches, what are our strategies as a government, do we want to do education and human capital development, do we want to provide income maintenance, do we want to provide basic needs and assistance. We've read all of that, we've talked about all of that. What these people are going to tell us is what this looks like in reality. This is not the textbook, right? So without further ado, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to introduce each of them because we introduced them all in class and I want them to talk. One of the reasons I'm not going to introduce them is because I want them to feel like they have to introduce themselves and their organization. Because part of what we asked them, this is not putting them on the spot, we have asked each of them to say what their role is in the policy-making process, what they see as the opportunities and the challenges. And so we'll get down to that now. But first, I want you all to remember that you have questions to ask them. So don't be shy. After they've done their brief introductions and talked about who they are, what their organization does, or what their role in the policy-making process is, be thinking about what your questions are that you came up with in class. So, we'll start at this end of the panel. Your guys' mics are also wired, and we'll move down. So, brief introduction, who you are, what your organization does, what you see as the opportunities and challenges in this policy area, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So I get to go first. Megan? Yeah.
No, it is.
Okay. So I get to go first. I'm Patty Fields, Vice President for Community impact and engagement in the United Way of Johnson and Washington County. And I've been working in nonprofits and the kind of social service field for a very long time. I won't tell you how many years, but it's been a while. But I've been at the United Way now for 8 years. And so the United Way's focus is actually at the community level and on a community organizing level. So the main our main focus is, our main focus is 3 areas of education, income, and health, because research tells us that those are the building blocks of a good quality of life. Needing to have access to quality education that will provide lead to a job and some financial stability that has enough of a family supporting wage, so enough that they can support their families and have enough savings, and also access to health care, quality health care, so they can, all the way through to retirement, have a stable income and good quality of life. What does that really mean on the ground? It means that there are a lot of moving parts and pieces, and so United Way is focused on data and research. And so every 5 years, we convene a community-wide assessment to understand what are the current needs, what are we seeing in trend lines around poverty, around the issues that affect that, everything from affordable housing to food insecurity to our job market and our wages that are available to the community, and all those different pieces. So we can understand when we're building strategies and mobilizing resources. So resources meaning both monetary and human resources, so the volunteering piece, and also building multi-sector collaborations, because any of these issues are not solved by any one organization or nonprofits, one sector. It takes businesses, it takes government, it takes nonprofits, it takes the faith communities to kind of all work together to address these sorts of community level change needs. So that's really what we focus on and put pieces through, and we build both investments in many nonprofits who are serving the community and serving those issues, and we also invest in initiatives, knowing that there's a community level change piece as well. So we have everything from a Healthy Kids initiative to a financial stability and financial literacy initiative, and we've been very much invested in out of school time, knowing that the out of school time area for before and after school and summer for kids who are on their educational path are significant once you combat everything from summer learning loss to provide stable and educational supports to support their learning in school. So all the different kind of pieces. The United Way is about kind of pulling them all together and advocating. So there's a lot of policy level work that's done too, because the challenges really are awareness and making sure that people are thinking and working on these issues, because it, again, it takes more than any one of us to do that. And then also at the policy level locally, that local governments also understand that the policies and the decisions they make at their decision level affect all of the community, and then also all the way up to, for us, a lot of work at the state level, because there's a lot of things that happen, whether it's everything from child care assistance to support for food banks that affect things locally. So that's the work that we're doing every day.
Hi, my name is Natalie Veldhouse. I am the Community Food Security AmeriCorps Vista at the Crisis Center of Johnson County. The Crisis Center, I think of it as kind of having 2 halves. One half we provide crisis intervention services. So we have multiple 24-hour crisis hotlines, we have crisis chat and text, and we offer a lot of suicide prevention training in the community. The other half that I work with is the food bank. So we have a food bank that's open 5 days a week. We also offer emergency assistance to people if they have a past due bill, they need help with rent, utilities. We help with other things like people get work boots, help them recover a lost ID. And if you don't have a permanent address, you can also receive mail at the Crisis Center. So we have a lot going on. With my work, I primarily work with the Hunger Task Force, which is just kind of a gathering of local government officials, nonprofit leaders, and just kind of citizens who are invested in alleviating food insecurity in the community. I've been serving on that since December, and as part of that, I've been working on different community-based research efforts like surveys and interviews and key informant interviews to kind of figure out where we're at with food insecurity in Johnson County. And during my year, I will be helping develop a community-wide plan on how we can implement new programs or what we can do to increase access to food in the county, and I'll be helping implement that plan. Another part of the 100 Task Force is kind of taking the issue of food insecurity in our county and bringing it together with a local foods movement, because there's been a lot of interest in that recently, and just having local farmers kind of connecting them with people who are in need of food.
My name is Chrissy Canganelli, and I'm the Executive Director of Shelter House. I've been with Shelter House for about 17 years now. My undergraduate degree is in economics, and my graduate degree is in urban and regional planning with an emphasis on housing and community development and homeless poverty, where we kind of fit into this puzzle is Shelter House is a not-for-profit organization. We're a grassroots organization. We are a homeless service provider. With that said, our core service is that we provide emergency shelter for men, women, and children who are experiencing homelessness in our community. But we're much more than just a roof and a bed. We provide a continuum of services that help people move beyond homelessness. We have support services that help address people where they are. Some people, when they come to us, they already have jobs. Many people don't, so we help them find jobs, get placed in jobs. We help them with clothing that they may need for work, transportation assistance. We help families to keep their children in school. We help the disabled and elderly to access health benefits and disability benefits that they qualify for. So we can't do this without being very connected to other providers in our community, both public and private. So that's part of our responsibility, is that we leverage these community resources and bring them together. From time to time, we're providing some of those services internally where it makes sense. One example of that is we've started 2 small businesses within Shelter House. We knew that we wanted to provide nutritious meals for the residents that are staying with us. We have 70 people a night that are staying at Shelter House. So we have incorporated a commercial kitchen in our facility. The people who are working in our kitchen are graduates of our training program. They're making nutritious meals for our residents, but they're also making meals that we make available to Prelude Behavioral Services and youth homes. So in so doing, we have a small business that's running within our organization. We're providing nutritious meals for the community, over 55,000 meals a year, and providing job training and placement for some of our folks. We also started a janitorial business, which is part of a permanent supportive housing operation that we provide for people who have serious persistent mental illness. So indeed, we have services that range everything from emergency shelter all the way through permanent supportive housing. Our janitorial business is again made available to the community, and it's providing permanent job placement for people who otherwise have not been able to sustain employment. So we have a pretty broad reach in the services that we provide, all intended to help people not only move beyond homelessness, but not return to homelessness. We do not have direct influence on policy other than to speak out on certain issues, to be advocates when it's appropriate. That is one of the frustrations and concerns, is that of course as a grassroots organization we're responding to a need that already exists and indeed is manifesting from a public ill. We don't have control over all those different components of the equation that have brought people through our doors, nor do we have control over the domains that will help them not come back through our doors again. Primarily the fact that when people are getting to work, they're sustaining employment, they're not making what living costs. We have a housing wage here in our community of over $15. I think it's $15.38 for the median price 2-bedroom apartment. The folks we're working with, when we're getting them placed into employment, they're typically not making that much money. So you're then kind of feeding into this self-fulfilling prophecy that people are going to need to be dependent on these other supports, from housing vouchers, FIP, different kinds of supports that they get demonized for later on, just to be able to make ends meet and sustain their households. That is often a frustration for me, and I don't have control over making that kind of change. But at the same time, I keep beating my head against that wall. One area where I do singularly have a different level of influence than just within my organization, though, is that I participate on a statewide council, the Iowa Council on Homelessness, which is appointed by the governor. We do have influence to a certain extent over policy making because we work side by side with leaders from different state agencies. And right now, I am chair of the Policy and Planning Committee, and we are essentially creating a system of homeless service provision and establishing statewide standards on services, performance, operations, and governance, because these things do not exist. And what we'd like to see is that for anyone who is experiencing homelessness across the state of Iowa, as they come through any of the doors of our homeless service providers, that they're guaranteed a baseline of service and consistent expectations of what that means. So that's what we're working towards there. So it may seem kind of very micro level, but that's where we are as a state in addressing homelessness. And I think with that said, that's all I have to give.
Good evening. Brian Loring. I am the Executive Director of Neighborhood Centers of Johnson County. I've been in this position for 20 years, so I started back in 1995. We are, if in some of your studies you've come upon the concept of the settlement house, that's kind of the model in which we're built upon, is the settlement house model. So we have a couple of centers in Iowa City. Both of them are located in neighborhoods that have a fair amount of low-income housing. We have our Broadway Center, which is on the southeast side of Iowa City, and we also have a center on the west side, which is our Pheasant Ridge Center. And those really offer our core programming. We provide our core programming out of those centers. We will also do quite a bit of work out in the schools. So we have after-school programs in 3 schools in Iowa City. We also do some kind of enrichment programs and after-school programming in other schools around Iowa City. The after-school programs that we offer in Iowa City are really licensed programs. And we also do in North Liberty and some other areas around the Iowa City School District offer kind of enrichment and educational programs after school for kids. And we also have a number of we have preschool programs in Grantwood Elementary School, which is on the east side of Iowa City. So we're doing programming out in the community and doing outreach into some of the mobile home neighborhoods around Iowa City as well. So that we do, beyond the centers that we operate, we also do outreach. We're a little bit different than some human services in that we are not, you do not have to have an issue or problem or crisis to come in and be a part of the center. And I often say that you can come in on the best day of the worst day of your life. You don't really, we're open both days to you. So there's sort of a notion that you come in and there's a relationship building process that if in fact at some point in your future you have a crisis, we have those relationships built so that it's really easy to help folks. I read an essay about a program that had been done a few years ago when troops were being deployed in Iraq, and they were basically offering or connecting people who were about to be deployed to mental health providers. The point of that was really just to build those relationships so that when they returned from combat, those relationships pre-existed. And that's kind of the same notion that we have, is that you come into the center, we can build a relationship, and at some point there's probably going to be a crisis. And so if that happens, people know where to turn to come to the center. We also put an emphasis on connecting families to other families, and the point of that is really just strengthening kind of the natural networks of support that people have. Human services really can't do it all, so it's important that we focus on folks' strengths and try to build their network of support in the community with other families, with community institutions and that sort of things. The other thing that I think makes us a little bit unique is that we try to, well, not unique, but we are in the neighborhood, so in a lot of ways we're very responsive to things that are happening in the neighborhood. We are, despite the fact we have Johnson County in our name, we are a private nonprofit organization, a 501c3, and we started really as an outgrowth of some efforts between parents in a neighborhood and some volunteers from the School of Social Work here at the university to bring after-school programs to kids in neighborhoods where there weren't a lot of things going on. So we have very kind of a humble beginning, but that that same sort of responsiveness to what's happening in the community leads me to kind of an anecdote related to public policy issues. And I want to just share one example with you that has had a huge impact on our organization as well as the families that we serve. This dates back to my early days in the center. When I first started back in the mid-90s, the state of Iowa had initiated some welfare reform initiatives that were pretty significant. And of course, one of the points of those initiatives was to get people into the workforce. On the heels of that came a much larger federal initiative, and maybe you studied the welfare reform initiative that happened in 1996. Both of those things really kind of pushed people into the workforce who maybe had not been in the workforce or were returning to the workforce and needed, one of the things that folks needed was childcare. And their childcare assistance is what folks who are in those situations rely on to pay for childcare. And so what happened was that people were kind of thrown into the market with childcare assistance as a stream of funding to help them pay for childcare, and yet there weren't providers in the community to take that source of payment and provide childcare for those families. So it became kind of a bit of an issue, and we had a meeting. I remember this meeting was probably sometime in 1995, meeting with parents and having them sort of come to us and say, we really are going to need childcare, and so is there something you guys can do to help? And so we embarked on an effort to kind of retool the organization to meet some of those needs. And when I started, we had a 12 slot. This is an early childhood program, and we had 12 slots of early childhood cooperative care, which meant if you worked a couple of hours, you could get 2 hours in return of child care. And that was in 1995. And by 1997, we were doing over 120 spaces of child care at the center. So that was kind of a major effort for us, particularly at that time we were a smaller organization, so it was a big deal for us to take that on. But it has led to other issues that we've faced over the course of years, relying on that stream of funding as a primary source of payment for child care. So that's something that perhaps we'll get an opportunity to talk about a little bit more as the evening rolls on, but it's certainly an area that has been a challenge for us. So.
Hey, hi. My name is Wendy Rickman, and I work for Department of Human Services. I'm the division administrator for Adult Children and Family Services, which in DHS lingo means that we're the policy division. So my division is responsible to set policy for DHS for clients who access FIP services, so cash assistance through TANF. We set policy for SNAP or food assistance eligibility, for Medicaid eligibility, for child care eligibility, for dependent adult services, which is kind of our protective arm for dependent adults, and then all of the child welfare policies, so child protection, child abuse prevention. I've been at DHS about 29 years. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's degree in social work. I'm a licensed independent social worker. DHS at any one time serves about 1/3 of the state of Iowa. So we have almost 1 million folks unduplicated that we're serving at any one time in the state. Our fiscal year 17 budget is anticipated to be about $6 billion. About $2 billion of that comes from state general funds, and the rest of that money comes through federal match. So each of our various programs, whether it's SNAP, for example, our food assistance program is totally federally funded. So each of our programs has some kind of a federal match. So when we do a budget request, we really look at it in terms of state dollars and then total dollars that come into the state for services. Most of that budget goes for Medicaid type services. So our Medicaid program, our CHIP program, which is our kids program, we did kind of a Medicaid expansion with the Affordable Care Act. So some of that money goes to the Iowa Health and Wellness Plan, which is a little bit different than a straight Medicaid expansion. So my responsibility from a policy perspective is to set those statewide interpretations, if you will, of what the feds have told us we can do, what our state policymakers tell us that we can do, and try to find a mix between what they're telling us and what people, like you've heard introduce themselves, really need to do on the ground. In terms of what's hard about setting policy, I would just tell you it's hard. I spent a very long time in my career in the field. So I started as a child abuse assessor, and then kind of worked my way up. And when I was in the field, I'd say, how many dang people do they need to set policy? Now that I'm setting policy, I say, I don't have enough people to figure all this out because it's complicated. So the difficult part for me is to try to navigate between what our federal folks are saying, especially about people in poverty, the resources that we have. $6 billion sounds like a lot of money, but I will tell you that most of the people who access our programs are working. So if you talk about a FIP recipients that's getting cash assistance from the state, they are not just sitting on their couch eating bonbons and watching soaps. Most of our clients have at least one job. Many of our child care recipients are working 2 jobs and still qualify under our very low limits for these benefits. So the issues that folks are talking to you about in terms of making a living wage and actually getting out of receiving benefits is very difficult. So I look forward to your questions. I look forward to the conversation. And my position mostly is from that more statewide perspective of trying to navigate all of the different entities who have opinions about what policy should be. And everybody I talk to has an opinion about what DHS should be doing. So it's been interesting.
Okay, so with that, we have brought you the experts on Iowa and Iowa City. You have read all about what this is at a national level, but we have not spent that much time in Iowa or Iowa City or Johnson County or Iowa State. So you asked lots of questions about poverty in Iowa, about what families here are experiencing, what people here are experiencing. So we're going to open it up to your questions.
All right, it's a wrap.
Do my Phil Donahue. Just put it by your head.
It's definitely not on.
It's not?
No.
Oh, press the top button. Press the top button. Still on.
That's what happens when you go first, see?
Is it on now? It is. So one of the things that we've been talking about in our class is we've been talking about different kinds of welfare and like the ways that those programs, like which one, one of the questions that we were asked is like which one do we think is the best one or which one do we think is the most effective in terms of helping people sort of bring themselves up out of poverty and above the poverty line. And I guess my question that I would open up to the floor is which program do you find to be like the most helpful or the most impactful out of all of them?
My initial response would be that it's no singular program, and that's part of the complexity of it, is that really for any of them to be successful, you have to package them together for the individuals to qualify in order for people to be successful and to create a sustainable budget to live off of. If you're talking about a family household, it's not one program versus another, it's combinations of, and it can be very complicated for people to manage. So the food assistance programs, the health assistance programs in combination with housing assistance programs, all these different things which all have different qualifying criteria, all definitions are not consistent across the different application forms, but it's no singular one thing. And then how that can be impacted both negatively and positively when you start introducing employment income. It's not the same across different programs. You start to lose different levels of service. So it's a lot for a household to keep track of, but it's the combination of that.
I can tell you from the data that the support program that is the most widely used, or is for folks in Johnson County is Medicaid. We have the most of our folks in the poverty on Medicaid. And so certainly healthcare has a significant impact on a lot of things. But I also would say, much as what Chrissy was saying, is that there's poverty thresholds, and you probably learned a lot about that, the federal poverty rate. But then you think about what it takes to live in a community, and oftentimes those who are at that federal poverty rate don't make enough to actually have a good quality of life or figure out how to have a family-sustaining budget. And so we look at things such as the median income, median wages, not minimum wage, which is another policy issue that's happening right now, median. So it's the average that everyone makes in the county. And the folks who are doing that, who are at the median income, are struggling. And they do not make, they make way more than any of the income thresholds that would be for any of the means-tested programs, which is what we're talking about, from TANF to SNAP programs to Medicaid. All those are means-tested. And so we have learned that for families who make the median income, the only ones who really kind of 5 years ago were making it were two parents working at that same income, which was at that point, between the two of them, they had to make $26 an hour, the combined. Now we know 5 years later, our median income, our income in our area, has had very little growth over the last 10 years, just very little. But the cost of living has increased tremendously. So that gap between what they can earn and what they need to spend grows greater and greater. So we have more and more families who aren't even on these programs who really struggle and are month to month, and it only takes an illness, a car repair, a major, any kind of thing that happens in their lives, and that tips the balance.
So a recurring theme in a lot of our readings involves the war on bad behavior. And this is kind of something that Wendy kind of touched on in terms of, the amount of jobs and the amount of work that is required to keep a steady living for a lot of these people. My question is, in regards to the war on bad behavior, what do you think are, very common misconceptions regarding the public's opinion about people in poverty? What are there any perceptions that do align? Are there any, that definitely don't? And do you guys have any suggestions as far as changing public opinion on these matters?
I would say, like for every one of our populations, over time there seems to be kind of an evolution of thinking and drawing conclusions about people who receive benefits. The families that I meet, and it doesn't matter what program you talk about, the families that I meet in child welfare love their kids. They want to do what's best for their kids. I have worked in this field for almost 30 years and I don't meet people who don't love their kids. I do meet folks who either don't have the skills to keep their kids safe, they were never taught how to do that, or they are victims of a systemic kind of keep your hand on the top of them, keep them as low as you can. It's kind of those people that really impacts how we provide services. Are we going to spend our dollars? Drug testing is a great example. Over the last couple of years, there have been lots of bills, forwarded that talk about drug testing FIP recipients or drug testing SNAP recipients. The research that's been done in states that have tried to do that very clearly shows that that is not an issue in this population to the extent that you would get a return on investment in trying to figure out how the heck to manage it. But it keeps coming up and keeps coming up. From my own perspective, I would say that over time, we have begun to separate ourselves from the families that we serve, and that is very dangerous in my mind. The only difference between me and the families that I work with every day is that I've had a support system around me, and I've had opportunities that can keep me moving up the ladder. Now, to some extent, our folks get into some behavioral things that can burn bridges in their own families and those kinds of things, but the idea that they are not the expert of their own situation is very dangerous. There is no difference between me and the families I work with except the opportunities that I've had to do something different. So we try to impact those conversations daily. The number of, in my division, we answer what are called requests for information, RFIs. And a majority of those come from legislators, although we get requests from lots of folks. We handle anywhere from 500 to 700 a year, and I would say that well over half of those are punitive asking kind of questions. Why aren't we drug testing? What is the average income of the folks that are getting these benefits? In child welfare, why don't we do more removals of kids? On the other side, we have folks that are saying, well, we do too many removals. So in general, I think that we have, over time, I sense, a much more punitive, angry, penalizing kind of system that really, in the end, it doesn't matter what program you're on. If the approach is to penalize and be punitive, you don't respond in that kind of environment. I don't respond in that kind of environment, and it keeps you from putting the resources you have to the activities you really need to do to help people do better. So to the extent that, when you ask what you can do, to the extent that we continue to look at families the same way we would want to be looked at if we were receiving services, we can make progress. Everybody that I talk to has an opinion about people who abuse their kids. And they're very quick to tell me what should happen with those kids when something happens in a family. But it changes if I come to their house. So if I knock on your door, because I would ask you, how many in this room have absolutely nobody in your family whose parenting ever concerned you? One person, right? We all have things going on in our families. The difference between our families a lot of times and the families we serve is the ability to absorb that, to support each other, to wrap ourselves around that issue, to try to solve it ourselves. And if I knock on your door and say that I'm going to have to do a removal of your child for a safety issue, do you want to know where that kid is placed? Do you want to be able to participate in a case plan? Do you want to be able to visit regularly? Do you want your mom and dad to be able to come as grandparents and visit? Those are very important policy kind of decisions that we make about our families, and that's not always the way that things are perceived when you talk to other folks about who our families are. So from my perspective, the best thing that you guys can do is continue to learn about this stuff, and when you hear people talking about the families who access benefits, the families who access services, is to think about, many of you have probably accessed some kind of service before. Many of you may have to access services in the future, but we are the same families. There is no big difference. It's just the circle of opportunity that you've had and support that you've had that keeps you from being in that circumstance. So our job is to create that circle of support, to try to rebuild bridges within families, to try to rebuild community connections so that our families can move from where they are to where they need to be. That was a very long answer for a short question, but
Well said.
thanks.
Well, and I think that we hear a lot, that Ray kind of has, is the intersection of a lot of different places. So we hear a lot from businesses and donors and folks who are really interested in all these topics in some level. And we hear a comment a lot about they just need to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, pull up their bootstraps, and pick themselves up. And like really not understanding and I think a holistic idea of compassion and understanding where people are in their situation. And I think we all hold our own biases at times too when you start to think about any of these things. And I've worked with several different agencies in these communities, including the Crisis Center. And one of the things that I used to work with a lot of students, and I'd ask them, what does hunger look like? Does everyone have a picture in their mind? Do they realize that hunger in our community looks like every one of us here? You know, people who may not have any, at one point in their week or their month, know where maybe their food's going to come from. And so that's the kind of pieces that I think when we talk about bad behavior, it's also understanding that just like she said, the families are like all of our families, it's about all of us.
I really like your question. I think working with public opinion on the families and individuals that we serve is something that's been really important in my job recently. I've been going around to different food pantries in the county and just talking to people who run the pantries. And there's one small town that I've been going to and talking to them. And they have a really high poverty rate. And there are a lot of people in that community that are in need of food assistance. But there's such a strong stigma around accessing services in that community. People won't go to the food pantry. And there are also people who won't even accept like a sack of food that's brought to their doorstep. And there is a food pantry in the basement of a church, and there is a group of individuals in the community that are trying to shut down the food pantry because they don't want people to be taking handouts. And it's just a really tough situation because it's just kind of a hostile environment, and I feel that people have reservations about accepting services themselves, and I think that one of my challenges this year will be thinking about how I can work with that community and talk about how these people who are experiencing these things, they are your neighbors. You know, it's not, I don't know, I feel like there's just this like welfare queen perception of who's accessing these services, and I know, especially in Iowa and rural populations, a lot of what we're seeing is elder populations being really hungry. I don't know if that's something to think of when you think about people being hungry, but it's just something to think about, look at the data, and just kind of try to keep an open mind to who are accessing these services, and that it really can happen to anyone.
And our elderly population is by far the most underserved from a hunger perspective, and it's generational. My grandma was raised in the Depression. You used everything you had, and you didn't ask for anything from anybody. And so part of our DHS outreach has been specifically to elderly populations. When I was a child abuse investigator, part of our job was to do dependent adult abuse as well. And I visited many elderly homes where they had nothing. A lady who was basically licking her condiments, nothing in her house, and she would not apply for food assistance because in their generation, it was seen as something that just wasn't done. And that continues. If you think about the Iowa population, we are aging, not just me, but other people too. I'm almost at that level where I'm in there. But certainly the generation above me, it just wasn't done. And so the idea of trying to make that something that is life-saving and more palatable for folks, especially who are elderly, is a big issue for us. We do specific outreach around that because they just don't want to apply for benefit.
I think that the other thing is to keep in mind, just to sort of combat this, is to stay connected to these communities in some way. We've done a pretty good job of segregating ourselves from low-income people in a lot of communities, and I think that, I work at the neighborhood center, so when we get suspicious when we see white guys like me walking up the street, up to the door, it's like, who's that? What are they coming here for? That there must be bad, something bad is coming.
Probably from DHS coming to do something.
But I think it's important to spend time in the communities and stay connected to them, and it sort of helps you combat this demonization aspect of sort of where these kinds of policy initiatives come from.
Not to drag this out, but I can add one other perspective to it as well. The blaming mentality isn't just about trying to find some character flaw that people who are living in poverty must have, but it also extends to where you come from. And that's where I also see a whole nother level of divisiveness. And a real fear that I have is that your generation has grown up knowing pretty much no other rhetoric than the other. It has been hurled at you from the time that you could articulate anything, watching TV, every source of media. Because you're a little younger than my kids, and you've grown up in this phase of everything is about the other, it's me or you, It's not about what brings us together, it's what's different about us, and like glomming on to these differences is that somehow it's going to elevate one over the other. And I really do fear what that means is you start to inherit this next generation of responsibilities and take over from where we're leaving off. I can't tell you how frequently, other than these conversations of, well, that person, if they just worked harder, would have been able to lift themselves up and they wouldn't have been homeless, or if they just didn't drink or this or that, you know, whatever it was, they had some weakness. But on top of it, to say, well, are they from here? And then, are they from here? How long are they from here? It's so repulsive to me and offensive because underneath it is just blatant racism. And it's confusing to have and try to have an honest conversation about it because people will veil what their real frustrations or concerns are because they don't want to be labeled or understood as a racist, but they feel totally, permitted to say, I'll only support you if you can show and demonstrate that you're serving enough people who are homegrown. But at the same time, they can't define what that means. How long do you have to live in a community before you are from there? And if you're living under a bridge, and you've been living under a bridge for 10 years, are you from there? Are you from there when you finally die in the streets of there? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we deal with, and people feel emboldened to just call and ask. It's insane.
So you were just talking about that you all try to stay connected with these certain communities that especially need this poverty outreach. What are some of the ways that you try to stay connected with them?
Well, I think my comment is the challenge is to stay connected. Because I think several of us on the panel here are pretty connected. So I mean, because we work with families who are struggling income-wise every day. So, I mean, I think for you all, it's about where, picking, where do you pick to live, where do you pick to shop, where do you pick to, do you ride public transportation, I mean, there's a lot of ways to stay connected. Not to mention just, volunteering and making friends with folks. So, I think that's the challenge. And there was a, 20 years ago or so, there was a great, CBC radio thing. Professor Gordon, I know he's Canadian, so he maybe heard this. I don't know. Where they were interviewing families who had kind of asking them about what are your perspectives on people in poverty, and it was very much sort of in the vein that we're talking tonight. I mean, people who were very judgmental and there must be character flaws in marriage, and so then they introduced them to a family. And they spent time with the family. And at the end, they spent weeks with this family, intimate time with them. And at the end of this period, they went back to them and said, so now, let's get your perspective now. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm kind of truncating this whole thing. But in the end, they said, I still I believe what I believe, but it's not this family. This is a good family. And these people are trying and they're working hard. So the good, I mean, what came out of that for me is really just trying to stay connected to families, really kind of inoculate you from that demonizing families. And so I think that's just the message I would share.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. I'm actually probably loud enough without that. I'm right louder with it. So I find it fascinating that you talk about that and also about the differential in income. So you're staying connected with families, but do you see any programs in this area or in the state that link poorer families to wealthier families where they're mixing communities, they're seeing each other every day and learning that about each other?
Recently, and as a professor in the urban and regional planning, Dr. Anthony, who's in the Public Policy Center. He was talking a lot about inclusionary zoning, just talking about with developers when they develop new apartment buildings, making sure that a segment of those apartments that are going in are designated for low-income housing. And he talked about it as being kind of a silver bullet and that it would fix a lot of social ills, in that you are including different income levels together in the same neighborhood. And then if you think about the way that education is funded through property taxes and all those sorts of things, it just kind of diversifies things so there's not such concentrated pockets of poverty, and then also just like concentrated pockets of affluence.
I think it also has to be purposeful, and I think that's one of the things that I just learned from a conversation I had this week with a local elected official who, as we were talking about, are those natural connections where we have a lot of different families who make connections, who have contact with each other, and it happens in the schools. That's where we have the most kind of mixing of folks of all different income ranges, and whether it's the kids themselves, and then also families when they are attending events and things. That's the most contact most people have, in a diverse nature that way. But this is like the official was telling me, but he himself in his own day may not even have contact with someone who makes minimum wage because of his neighborhood that he lives in and where he works and what he's doing. He really doesn't even have that. So really, a lot of things, if we think about what happens naturally, is in schools. And so the rest of it really is about awareness and being purposeful.
Earlier, Chrissy, you mentioned that a lot of the different programs had different definitions of eligibility and how those things were defined, but how much effort is there, or is there even effort to make it so that it's the definitions or the ranges of eligibility are shared across the board?
So I have about a 10-page spreadsheet just for Medicaid. Medicaid typically looks at income, assets, resources, and each of our populations have different eligibility criteria. Some of that is determined by the federal government. So, for example, our food assistance folks tell us where our eligibility limits are going to be set. In Medicaid, they give us minimums. So they say you can't go below, for example, 135% of poverty. Many of our programs go way above that. So there's lots of our pregnancy prevention programs that will go up to 300% of poverty. There is a conversation going on right now to try to either bring them more in line or eliminate programs and combine them because we have so many and they're very complicated. I will tell you though, to some extent, that is not being done necessarily to assist people, it is to manage costs. So the question that was asked of the department was, you tell us what the federal minimums are and you tell us every program that Iowa has set above those minimums. So depending on which side of the aisle you're on or which part of the conversation you're on, there's always a push to try to raise the minimums for those folks that think these services are really necessary. On the other side, there's always an effort to try to bring them down to the bare minimum requirement that the feds set for us to continue to get that federal reimbursement. So I would tell you on the child welfare side, the eligibility criteria has nothing to do with income. It has to do with whether or not we have a child who has been deemed to be abused or neglected. It's the same for dependent adult services. But every other program that we have, there are income and asset limitations. So what you see, for example, we will have a big factory closure in Iowa, or a big company will shut down, and we send our folks out to help people get through that process. And they will apply for benefits, and in their mind, they are at the very lowest they have ever been. They're now without a job, they maybe worked for that company a long time, and then we sit down and talk to them about how they don't qualify for our benefits because they still have boats, or they still have ATVs, or they still own their own home, and all those things we count in our income eligibility determination. So they're very frustrated with us because they cannot imagine being any lower than they are when they get fired or laid off from that company. And they are so far above our income guidelines that they're not even close. And it's another situation where people really sit and take a different look at our benefits programs, because I think there's an assumption that those income guidelines are much higher and that folks really do have the ability to make money on FIP or to make money on Medicaid. That's not the case. So we are undergoing an effort to try to simplify and reduce some of those eligibility limits, so across at least our Medicaid programs, they're more similar, but it's not necessarily being done to help people.
I think that where the government sets, or governmental programs that set those kind of guidelines, I know that that's kind of where somewhere like the crisis center will come in. The crisis center, anyone can come in. We ask about income, we ask about household size, but we don't ask for ID, we don't ask for proof of residence, and anyone, if they say they live in Johnson County, we can help them. We don't verify their income. And I think that a lot of clients that we see are people where they used to receive SNAP, and then one tiny thing happened, they had a little wage increase, something happened that bumped them right above the guidelines. So they're still completely in need, and there's also just a really hard cutoff. Like there isn't kind of something that beams you off of a program like that. And so that's a lot of the families that we're seeing in the crisis center. We serve about 1,000 individuals every week, and we just did a survey in different food pantries in Johnson County, and we asked people where, how do you get food in a typical month? And there are a lot of people who said, I just use my cash and I come to the pantry. And then if the question is, why aren't we using SNAP, why aren't we using food stamps? It's because there's some little thing that just keeps them right above the threshold.
Well, and Brian's really aware. In our child care program, for example, we have, and this is actually a good thing, we're partnering differently with businesses to try to come up with a strategy, because we have child care recipients who are refusing raises. So their boss will come to them and want to give them a promotion. The amount of money that they're going to make in their promotion will throw them over our eligibility limits, so they refuse it, because the amount of their raise is not going to pay for their child care. It's called the child care cliff. And so we're trying to partner with businesses differently to maybe subsidize a smoother transition so that they're not falling off that cliff, but can still accept promotions, can still get those raises, and can move their way incrementally then to a position where they don't need the assistance anymore. Because you're either eligible or you're not eligible. We do some transitional kind of programs. So if somebody gets a job in FIP, we will do 12 months of transitional FIP so that they can continue to work their way up. But in almost all of our programs, that's exactly what happens. You're either on or you're off, and a lot of times that little bit of bump in your income is not going to make a difference in terms of being able to continue to keep your child care where it is. You can't pay for it. So we have folks who are actually refusing raises in their companies to try to stay on assistance, because they're doing, and it's another place where we vilify people when really you would do that in your family, I would do that in my family. It's trying to do the best you can for your kids. And so it is one of the better partnerships that we have with businesses to try to figure out how to lessen that cliff, to do a smoother transition, and allow people really to succeed in their work so that they can feel better about that as well.
I mean, you get a $2 raise and lose $600 or $700 in child care subsidies a month.
True.
So, it's a terrible place to be when that happens, because, you want people to improve their income, but it certainly doesn't improve their income if their out-of-pocket goes up as a result. So it's serious. We did when was it, last September? We did a thing with the Danish students. There was a panel similar to this with some students from Denmark at county, and they were just talking about human services, social services in the U.S. And I was watching the faces of the kids in the crowd as we were going through kind of the categorical eligibility stuff for these programs, because we're sort of talking like, oh, and then if you have this, you can get that, and at some point it's just like we have to stop this because they just can't comprehend how complicated the eligibility requirements are for these programs. They just it was just like unfathomable for them. They just were blank. So
When we talk though about how hard it is to set policy, sooner or later all of you are going to be paying taxes, right? And the balance in terms of trying to figure out eligibility criteria that is funding programs that come from your tax dollars become a very lively conversation. Because folks want to know that their tax dollars are going for things that help. They want accountability for those tax dollars. Part of the evolution of programs, when Brian first talks about what they did in child care early on and the requirements that we require child care facilities and child care providers to do today are vastly different. And it all has to do with fraud, avoiding fraud, catching people who are cheating, or ensuring that the folks that we give public money to are actually providing the services that they're being contracted with to provide. So there is a balance in terms of trying to figure out how you provide those services in a way that are genuinely helpful, but also ensure that we have the public's trust in terms of their tax dollars through a general fund appropriation coming to us to provide those services. We have to make sure that the services that we're providing are actually the ones that are supposed to be being provided.
I can talk really loudly. So given that the slight increases in income can reduce your benefits and actually reduce your overall income, and then you said a little bit, talk about partnering with businesses. Are there, I guess, what overarching policy changes might you suggest to address that?
So I'm going to say this not as part of DHS, just because you guys invited me and I drove all the way from Des Moines. Okay? So I get to do just one editorial comment.
Please.
If we do not increase our minimum wage to something that is reasonable, we are going to continue to struggle with this issue generation after generation after generation. That's my, I have folks that we provide benefits to who are not working just one job. They are working 2 or 3 jobs and are not making enough money to get by, let alone get ahead, just to get by, and still can qualify for our benefits. As low as our standards are, it's not right. And so like I always say when I retire, I'm going to be a rabble-rouser, because I have to walk this edge, see? I'm in this job, and I'm a social worker. I am going to be a rabble-rouser, and that's where I would start. That we have got to pay people a living wage, and it is the difference between what my generation had growing up, what my dad's generation had. They had an ability to get a job, work their way up in a company, and provide for their families. We have folks who are working 2 and 3 jobs and not only can't provide for their families, they're still qualifying for our benefits, which are set at such a low level that it doesn't even make sense. Okay, that was my story.
On child care stuff, there's some glimmers of hope here. About a year ago, they reauthorized the Child Care Development Block Grant Act last year, and in that there are, in the previous incarnations, it really was about warehousing kids while parent work. This really has more of a child development focus and does loosen up some of the eligibility things that are a problem for families and providers. And we have not implemented it yet, but it is coming. And maybe Wendy, I have to talk to her about it after she knows some information about it. But we're sort of waiting for this, and it will change the interface between parents or families and DHS as well as the providers. And it will be I think hopefully it will be a big improvement.
I want to add something too, is that so much of, we've always had poverty in this country, but the huge growth, the division between the haves and the have-nots, and the increase in poverty. Specifically, if you go back to the 1970s and start looking at the deconstruction of the manufacturing sector of the United States economy, so much of this goes back to what we have deconstructed year after year and gone more and more to a service sector-based economy. Those jobs don't pay what the manufacturing base did. They don't come with the benefits that they did. And even jobs that we do have in the manufacturing sector, so much of that has gone to, temporary employment positions. So those are even structured so that you have no accountability, you have no consistency in being able to expect a certain amount of income or benefits. You're working side by side with somebody who's making twice as what you are because you're in a temp job. So we have been seduced into this kind of new world economy. And all the further, more these jobs are paying less and less compared to what living costs. To add on to what Wendy said, at some point, my gosh, just pay more for your hamburger. We are, in essence, we'll vilify these families and individuals that are going to be relying on the benefits to make life work because they're working for jobs that don't pay with living costs. But look at it a different way. We are subsidizing the employers. That's 100% of what we as a country have decided to do. Every single day that we're working and doing this, we are subsidizing employers. And we buy into this inflammatory rhetoric that if we raise the minimum wage, the economy is going to fall apart, businesses are going to shut down. I've seen so many different permutations of that in the last 17 years, and it never happens. Because it's not real. But people get a lot of play with that kind of fear-mongering kind of language. So, yes, increase the minimum wage. Pay what living costs. Stop subsidizing employers, because it's all that we're doing, or at least talk about it in that way. Change the rhetoric. Do you know what the most expensive housing program that we have in this nation is? Other than jail. It is the credit, is it a credit or deduction that we get for home ownership? For interest that we pay on our mortgages and for property taxes. That lack of collected revenue that we possibly could as a nation be taking, there's no reason. In today's economy, there's been no recent research that shows that there is a correlation between the home ownership rate, which they were really trying to push up in the 1940s, to today's rates of home ownership. There's no connection between my benefit that I receive as a homeowner on my taxes to incentivize increased numbers of homeowners. So remove it. But there's no politician in this world, in this country, that's going to hang themselves on that kind of a policy because everybody who votes is benefiting from it. But please change the rhetoric and understand that as an entitlement program that it is. Benefits to farmers that keep land out of use, that is an entitlement program. Talk about it that way.
Let me tell you a story. This is, okay, I was very young and we all lived through it, so I'll tell you the story. They sent me out to do a speech when I was young, and I was with my boss, and it was with a bunch of farmers. And they were lovely people, don't get me wrong. But they were hammering on me about our families and really characterizing them as lazy and unwilling to participate. And at some point, I don't know, I said, you guys get paid to have your fields sit empty. I think that's kind of welfare, don't you? And we got run out of the hall. And so we were driving back to town, and my boss said, that was brilliant. Don't ever do that again. But it's true. I think we have to, I would encourage you to look at the number of things that we pay for from a government perspective and who that goes to exactly. The amount of money that we put into cash assistance, which averages about $300 a month for a family of 4, is not up there with the stuff that we subsidize otherwise from a government perspective.
Hi. I have a question about Delta Dental of Iowa. Are you familiar with the problems?
I have it, it's my insurance. Otherwise though, it's not, I'm not.
Okay, I won't ask my question then if none of you can speak to that.
Why don't you try and see what happens?
There's a lot of that.
Okay. I'll show you right. Raise your hand for your friend.
Well, I know.
It's a joint question.
So I'd like to play a little devil's advocate here. I'm sure all of you know Dr. Ben Carson. in his run for presidency. In a recent interview, he talked about his upbringing and how his mom went from place to place. And she had a quote that she said, "Never accept welfare, because if you get on welfare, you'll never get out." What is your response to that, knowing his success now?
What he said, and then on top of that, like, kind of how would you wean people off of it once they're on? Because like you were talking about how it makes sense, there's like a line, like a poverty line, but barely above that is still barely scraping by. So where do you take welfare away? I mean,
We're talking about farmers or?
no, like people like.
No, sorry, it's more national, not Iowa.
Poverty in general.
I don't know, I can respond to necessarily the question about not getting welfare, is once you get on, you can't get off. I think that there's a lot of things that communities can do and collectively work together about how do we help people build a better quality of life. And the fact is, a lot of these things have to do, we talked about minimum wage, we talked about pay, but a lot of it also has to do with skills, building skills to have employment that then could have that supporting wage. And not everyone has the skills currently for that sort of employment. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do as a community to talk about that and to work on that. That includes everything from childcare while someone is accessing education to gain those skills for that employment. And it's not always about a college degree, I'll tell you that. We are, as a community, I'll tell you, for those who are 25 and older in this community, we are over half of our population has at least a bachelor's degree. For those who are 25 and older, so that doesn't mean that everyone has access or the skills to have employment that would support their families. And so it's not just about that kind of education, it's also about skill building. Sometimes it's about retraining someone who has lost their job in one area but needs to figure out how to get another job that would support their family. So I think that those are some of the things that collectively can be, as a community, worked on and figured out, also with policy. And so I think those are kind of things. I will say that I think that there are some things that happen for families who have income supports, much as we've already talked about with the cliff effect, that one small increase in their wage can kind of set them off on a cliff. And that's where communities and partnerships between businesses and nonprofits and other groups in the community, the collective work can actually have an impact, because we can't always say that the answers are just in our government. I mean, because we know that's why Shelter House exists, that's why the Crisis Center exists, that's why neighborhood centers exist, because all of those things, it's not just about governmental programs, it's about how the community builds itself up and collectively works together on those issues.
The other thing is, we see families every day who succeed and get off benefits. Every day. Mm-hmm. The idea that families get on our benefits and stay for a lifetime is not accurate.
It's not possible. So, I mean, and most people are working. They are working. So
the average length that our average FIP recipient, for example, is a female, mid-20s with a high school diploma, working with 2 kids. The average length of time that she stays on benefits is about 1.5 years. So this idea that folks are getting on benefits and they stay for generations, I'm not saying that there aren't families who have accessed services for generations. We have those, but there's a 5-year limit in FIP. The folks that we're seeing are not the kind of folks that you hear about or that you're told are our clients. So one of the things that you guys can do is, you have somebody sitting at the end of the table who's very good at giving you the data, the actual figures, the actual profiles of folks. That is part of our responsibility, and I would say that's really part of your responsibility as young people who are now going to take over when we get too tired and old to do it anymore. You need to vote. You need to understand the data. You need to make your own decisions. You need to look behind the numbers or the rhetoric that you're told, and really try to find out what the facts are around some of these issues, because they are not always the way you see it on Facebook, or they're not always the way you see it in those kind of conversations. And when you know, then you and I may in the end disagree. You know, I have a partner who works in a factory. She builds tires at night. She thinks we should drug test our FIP recipients because she gets drug tested to get her paycheck. Why wouldn't we drug test FIP recipients? So we have very lively conversations, and I learned from her how I need to message my stuff. So, you know, we don't have to agree on this stuff, but I would encourage you, you know, you guys have the opportunity to be knowledgeable and be informed and to really look behind some of the things that you're told to find out exactly what the facts are. Because that's a lot of what all of us do every day is try to just, we don't have to agree, but understand what the facts are.
I want to thank you guys for your responses, just to start. And as a follow-up on, I can't see your name on the far left, I'm sorry. Patty? Okay. As a response to your question, or your answer on kind of skill building and getting people the skills they need for jobs, I've taken like a number of sociology classes. I mean, they're in high school, but I mean, they were still college-level sociology classes. So I'm not like new to this. And do we live in a society where we're all equal? I mean, like, I can't think of the name right now, there's a paradigm where like, they thought of it in like a machine, society's machine, and we need to have these like low-level people to have like the high level and have society function as a whole. So,
well, I think,
yeah.
you know, I think in some ways, as what Chrissy had already talked about, you know, kind of the evolution of our society in the sense that we have a very large, especially in this area, retail and service level jobs, that kind of piece. But that also knowing that that often does not lead to a family supporting wage. And so I think those are the kinds of discussions to have and figure out, you know, where people may access jobs, like jobs that may not have a wage, and what they might need to help them find some sort of financial stability and safety and security for their families, but also what part of their lives is that job relevant to. You know, I think that people stage through in that sense. We've had a lot of discussion actually we're talking about as in a corridor, so looking at Lynn County and Johnson County, because we are served by Kirkwood Community College, who has a very strong interest in workforce development and workforce, and they have a regional group that has been doing a strategic plan for that. And one of the things that we've had to have this discussion on is that for many things in workforce development, it's about building a career path and looking for advancement. And kind of what we were talking about before is how we've had opportunities in our lives through our jobs and through the things that we've done for advancement and increasing our income as our family grows, as we get older, and all those things. But there are some folks who the entry-level position may be just what they're trying to find is that stable job. So understanding our entire workforce is not just about how everyone's going to start advancing, but it is about how everyone has the opportunity to find employment that supports their families and their quality of life.
I think the paradigm you're talking about is structural functionalism. And so I think that this really comes down to a discussion of relative poverty versus absolute poverty. So, you know, whether people just aren't accessing this bare minimum, or they aren't attaining this bare minimum of needs that they have, versus there will always be the bottom 20% in any given society. But it's just a question of, you know, what does that look like? What is the standard of living for that population? You know, it can be vastly different depending on, like, you know, just kind of how things are shaped in the society.
This question's for Ms. Rickman, because I know you've touched on it several times. What's your opinion? Could you please elaborate on drug testing and FIP recipients? Specifically, what's your opinion?
I am not a fan. I will tell you that. I am not a fan. for two reasons. One of them is really personal. When I was growing up, we lived in public housing. We were on food assistance. In Montana, what that meant is that you got commodities. So you stood in a line and they handed you cheese and elbow macaroni, a lot of carbs. We had a lot of carbs. Flour, we had big cinnamon rolls a lot. And then when they moved to actually giving you food stamps, which is different than it is today, you went through the line and you had people looking in your cart. And I had Christmases where what I got for Christmas was jerky, potato chips, and M&Ms, sweet salty, you know. That was my Christmas. And so from a very personal perspective, when we're talking about safety net services, the decision in America should be, I think, people should be able to eat. They should have minimal cash assistance. They should have minimal child care services without that need to prove that they're not a drunk or they're not a substance abuser. There are minimal services that should be required for us just as a society to be human. So that's very personal. I hated that when people would stand and look at what my mom had put in the cart and we're handing over food stamps that look different from any other cash. That was very hard as a kid. So personally, that's there. The other thing that's a little more professional is that for those states that have implemented those policies, they spend millions and millions and millions of dollars for very little benefit. So you can go look at the research that was done in Florida, for example. Less than 0.1% of the folks that they drug tested actually tested positive for substances. I don't think Iowa's experience is that much different, frankly. I think we would put a huge amount of money into an infrastructure to try to manage and monitor and prove our case that could be spent in benefits. So when you look at, when I talk about a $6 billion budget at DHS, about 97% of that goes directly to services to families. We have a very, it feels like we have a lot of staff at DHS. But when you think about us serving at any one time 1 million people, we have a very, very small administrative cost. And so, you know, on the more professional side of that, I just think it has been tried, it has been done, and it is more of the rhetoric that talks about those people and their problems that keeps it going than anything that would tell us it would actually be helpful. Even in the states where they've tried to drug test recipients, they always have to have a path back. So, you know, I would rather, if we're going to take $10 million to blow on something, I would rather increase our substance abuse treatment programs, our mental health treatment programs. We have huge issues in Iowa with families who have mental health issues and kids who, we don't have a kids mental health system. We're working on that in Des Moines now. So I would rather, if we're going to take dollars to try to help folks, that we genuinely put it into services that would help. The research doesn't show that that bears any fruit. And from a personal perspective, I would just say it feels very icky to me. And that, you know, that's enough. Now, I'll also tell you, when you talk about the hard stuff about doing policy, if in the fiscal year 17 legislature we pass a law that says we're going to drug test, I'll figure out how to do it. That's what my job is. And if legislators ask me, I can't tell them I felt bad when I was a kid and people looked at my card. I have to say, here's how many recipients we have, here's what it will cost to drug test them, here's what it will cost, so you talk about impacts with them, but the more passionate side of this whole conversation doesn't typically come out in my job in the policy discussions. Most of the time where it comes out is on this advocacy side. We don't have the ability at DHS, we're in the executive branch of government. We work with the governor, we take the governor's perspective, we move the governor's message. That is our job. And so, you know, there's a balance in terms of trying to make sure that people know what the impacts are, but still do a diligent job of implementing what we are told to implement through the law. Another long answer for a short question, but that's my story.
And wasn't it Florida where the elected official that was really pushing to have that policy, the drug testing for, He was arrested for, what was it?
For cocaine.
For cocaine.
I have to say, I Googled when it happened.
Right? The government, right? Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy of it is just incredible.
Well, it's just this comes this root of worthy, you know, are you worthy to
Worthiness,
receive
yeah.
these benefits? I mean, I think Wendy did a nice job of describing where that impulse comes from, but it's, you know, it's misdirected, and I think the practical side of it shows that it's just not, it doesn't, the numbers don't pan out.
I was just that, one of the things that I would encourage you guys to look at, because we haven't really touched on this at all, and that's the idea of structural racism and how we have as a country really systematically put different groups of people in different places. I was at a great conversation the other day. We had a national expert in it, and in the child welfare field, we're working very hard on issues of disproportionality. Disproportionality is basically the situation where in Iowa, for example, African American kids make up about 5 to 6% of our population. In the child welfare system, they make up 13 to 14%. So we are disproportionately removing kids and moving them into the child welfare system, and we're trying to reduce that. One of the things that I would encourage you just to Google and you can take a look at is a series of tapes called Race the Power of Illusion. And it talks about how we have, over time, at every turn, made policy decisions that put certain families, and certainly families of color, into categories and kept them from receiving the other opportunities that I would say give folks a ladder up and out. So I was with this national expert in this big group of 170 people, and he said, I wonder, he was talking actually about racial profiling. He said, I wonder if in Chicago, at the end of a Cubs game, they set up hundreds of police officers to do traffic stops at every corridor where people left to figure out whether anybody was drinking, what that profile would look like. And I think when you talk about some of this stuff, you have to be aware of what kind of conversations we're having about neighborhoods where people are poor, where schools are where people are poor, where benefits are being given when people are poor, and really think about how we systematically kind of impact those populations in a way that really keeps them from moving anywhere but where we have put them. It's an important concept, and that's a good series of tapes to take a look at if you're thinking about what we've done structurally.
Home ownership in and of itself is one thing that you can look at too, and the ability of Caucasian, white America to have access to home ownership as a wealth building tool, as opposed to African American households, minority households who did not have access to that for the years that we had, decades and decades of years.
World War II, at the end of World War II, when VA loans started, they were specifically started to help soldiers coming back from the war purchase homes. It caused the biggest homing boom in our history. And those VA loans were not available to African American soldiers, even though they had fought alongside in their segregated units through the entire war. There's lots of information out there about how we've systematically kind of messed with the system in a way that it's not just about pulling you up by your bootstraps anymore. There's a whole different dialogue going on.
Okay, so since we only have a few minutes left and this is a panel, the same way we ended last panel, I'm going to end this panel, which is to ask each of the panelists to discuss a little bit about why you started working in this area, how you came to be where you are, what inspires you to do what you do.
I did not originally go to school to work in the field in the area that I am in, but I started volunteering while I was in college at the neighborhood centers in Johnson County, and then I, while I was in college, started to work there. And over that course of time, I have worked for 4 of the service organizations in our community before I landed at my current position. And when I spent a lot of years working with families, advocating for families, understanding the issues and things that they were dealing with on a daily basis. and try to put those pieces together and help them find their voice in a system that often doesn't give them a voice. And so then on the level that kind of the progression for me of moving and kind of understanding how all the different pieces work and that time spent working with families, now I have the tremendous opportunity to work at a community level, organizing, discussing, having a lot of discussions like this today, but with all kinds of different sectors and different folks together, and then trying to help put pieces together. And like I was talking before about resources, and not just about financial resources, but people and the power of conversation and advocacy to affect community level change, which of course is much slower than I'd ever want it to be. But it's important work, and so I have, my whole journey has been about how to help figure out as a community to make sure that everyone has that voice and that we are always working on how we improve conditions for everyone. Because when we are improving conditions for the folks who have the greatest needs, it makes it a community that is a great place to live for everyone.
I haven't gone very far. I graduated from the University of Iowa earlier this year in May. I was an office of public policy major with a focus in sociology. But I think what really got me started on this path, I experienced a kind of family tragedy in high school, and I transferred from being in a top-ranked high school where the free and reduced lunch rate was 5% to an alternative high school where the free and reduced lunch rate was 80%. And just the population of people I was going to school with was drastically different. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, so it's a lot different from in Iowa City, but just seeing the differences that people I was in school with were experiencing just between those two different schools really started me thinking about poverty and inequality, and then I just kind of ended up in a sociology class by happenstance at a community college, and it really just turned my brain on. And I was in a class called Poverty, Inequality, and Public Policy with Professor Brooke 2 years ago. And that really got me thinking, and I don't want to be a brown noser, but I do think that class is a big part of why I'm here. Yeah, sorry. Right, yes. Sorry, to be obnoxious. But so from there, I ended up doing an internship with the Crisis Center. I think you can still do it in the sociology department. It's called like, I don't know, something internship, social services organization, something. So I was just randomly emailing social services in the area. I got something from the Crisis Center, interned with them. I actually started working on the Hunger Task Force while I was still an undergrad. And then at the end, they were like, hey, we have this AmeriCorps Vista position opening up. Would you like to basically continue what you're doing as an intern as an AmeriCorps Vista? And I said, sure, awesome. So if anyone has any questions about the AmeriCorps Vista program or ways that you can take what you're learning in the social sciences and apply them in a career that is not only graduate school, please feel free to, I can give Professor Brooke my information, feel free to call or email me.
I also had an experience when I was, actually it was junior high. My family traveled around the world. My dad worked for Standard Oil. He was an engineer. He designed oil refineries. So I grew up a pretty privileged life for the first 13 years of my life. When we were living in Egypt, he became very ill with a brain abscess. And he became ill on Christmas Day, and it was the timing of his illness, and that we were essentially abandoned by the very company that was just a core part of our life. It was like an extended family. And because of the evolution of the events that happened to my father and my family and that abandonment that we experienced, and just things that people just did not do what they said that they would do, or should have done, it inspired in me. It was a genesis of just a deep passion for standing up for people who have been abandoned by their family, their loved ones, their communities. I didn't understand that in myself until I was much older, but it really does connect back to this traumatic event that happened in my childhood, and then just over time has built a passion to help others. Because through that event, I also found how wealthy and how rich we really were. Not monetarily, but the resources that we as a family could bring to bear through all the events that happened in my life following, and my brothers and sisters. So when I went through my divorce, when my brother returned from war with PTSD, alcoholism, drug addiction, I have a sister who's bipolar, we're quite a cocktail going on in my family. We all had my parents and our family to turn back to, and the resources and the home that they always provided for us, irrespective of what was happening. We had that to go back to. So my connection to my work grew over time, but has the genesis back in that early childhood now.
Well, I hate to disappoint, I don't have necessarily that personal connection to it. I was, as a kid, was kind of a social justice and I was a Saul Alinsky nerd as a kid. So I read a lot of books by folks who were working in the area of community organizing and so forth. And so eventually I got into a master's social work program here in the university and started some neighborhood organizing in this area, and then moved to the West Coast and did some work out there organizing. And you know, really learned this through that work, the power of and the importance of community, the importance of you know, those networks of support that folks have. You know, I think one of the things that we need to caution of, be prepared and be cautious of in our business is, you know, really looking at folks and emphasizing their deficits. It's really easy in the work that we do because we're responsive to deficits, we're responsive to need and crisis and that sort of thing. But what people don't really want to be seen as someone with a crisis. I mean, you know, they don't want to see that, have folks in our business looking at them and saying what's important about you are your deficits, you know. And so the work that we do at the neighborhood centers is really more about meeting people where they're at. They can come into the centers on good days or bad days. It's not about having a deficit that, you know, having a crisis to be a part of the center. And that to me is very appealing. It's sort of that natural connectedness you have with folks. You know, and I think that as you know, modern society, we've lost some of those important institutions that kept us connected. And so organizations like ours can fill some of those gaps, and we don't have, you know, churches aren't as important in the community, labor unions, those kinds of things that kept people together and working together have kind of have sort of dissolved over the years. And so it's important for those of us in our business to try to keep folks connected. And that to me is what's inspirational in trying to, we try to continue to keep that going in the centers where I live.
So I told you part of my deal. You know, when I was a kid, I've always been the fan of an underdog. If I'm watching a football game, it doesn't matter really. I'm always cheering for who's behind. You know, unless it's the Bears. And they're always behind because I love them, so. Oh my God. I'm like a Bears, Cubs, Bulls. We're just big losers all the way around. So I've always just been a fan of the underdog. I think in terms of, you know, being at VHS, I've spent my whole really adult life there. I've been there 29 years. I think the work that we do at Department of Human Services is so critical to the life of kids and their families. I think, you know, if the corner that I try to turn with my staff in terms of setting policy is to remember that change in our families happens at the speed of trust. This expert that I was with talking about racism the other day said that there was a quote that says you cannot legislate change of heart. And I think we try to pass bills to put guidelines on people that doesn't necessarily change their heart. And I'm about changing people's heart. I think if you think about some of the significant policy changes that have happened recently, stuff around gay, lesbian, transgender, same-sex marriage, that change transformed in a fairly short amount of time once it hit a tipping point. And that tipping point happened because everybody knows somebody that's gay, and we all kind of decided the world wasn't going to fall apart, right? When you know somebody, when you have a relationship with somebody, you can see their point of view, and you start to view that differently. That's what I try to engage in my work. It's not always easy in policy. It was much easier when I was a worker, really, to some extent, because I love working with families. I love facilitating family team meetings. I love seeing families who go from being really kind of broken to coming back to me and saying, you know what, we're okay and we're going to continue to be okay. That is awesome. In this job, it feels more removed. It's at a higher level, but my passion is in exactly the same place. We're only going to get ahead if we continue to engage with each other, and if we continue to try to see somebody else's point of view and know what that feels like, then we can move forward. And that's what I stay in the business for.
That's a good note to end on. Let's